When I came back from a quiet visit with an old friend, I expected to see the porch light glowing faintly, and to hear the soft, familiar hum of home greeting me from behind the front door. Instead, what I found was my life, boxed up and tossed aside like discarded junk. My lamp lay tipped over on the doormat, the cord tangled and twisted. My suitcase sat against the bushes, half unzipped, its contents spilling out like it had been dragged there in a hurry. On top of everything, taped to a framed photo of me and my son, was a single folded piece of paper. 6 words. No warning, no context, no explanation, just quiet elimination. In that instant, I felt something deeper than betrayal take root inside me. This wasn't only about being shut out. It was about being erased, replaced, without hesitation or guilt. Have you ever stood at your own doorstep and felt the air tell you that you don't belong anymore? That evening was utterly still, the kind of quiet that hangs heavy in the air before a storm breaks. I had only been away for a few days, spending time with an old friend upstate. Nothing dramatic, no conflict, no tension, at least none I had allowed myself to see. When I left, the house had been calm. Brendan hugged me as I got into the car. Kayla smiled, saying she'd make sure to water the garden while I was gone. But when I stepped out of the rideshare onto the driveway, something immediately felt off. The porch light wasn't on. Every window was dark. Then I saw it. My suitcase, sitting neatly beside a plastic storage bin. On top was a small pillow, the one I'd sewn myself decades ago, its edges frayed by time. My bedside lamp rested next to it. 2 framed photos, one of my late husband, another of the 3 of us when Brendan was still in college, sat propped up together. And there, folded once and pinned under a magnet, was a note written in my son's unmistakable handwriting. Sorry, Mum. No space for you anymore. No punctuation. No signature. I stood there for a long time, unmoving. I didn't cry. I didn't knock. There was nothing to say. I lifted my suitcase carefully, placed the photographs inside, tucked the lamp under my arm, and turned away from the door without once looking back. My footsteps didn't echo. No curtain moved. The silence was louder than shouting could ever be. At the end of the street, I turned once, just once. The porch was still dark. Then I kept walking. That night, I slept on a bench near the community garden a few blocks from the house. It wasn't comfortable, the metal dug into my back, but I wasn't ready to call anyone yet. I needed quiet. Not the cold, suffocating silence of a locked door, but the soft, forgiving kind that exists in the first breaths of morning, in the rustle of maple leaves and the hum of early birds. The garden had always been my refuge. Years ago, before Kayla entered the picture, Brendan and I had built a compost bin there together. I'd taught him how to trim herbs without hurting the roots. Back then, I'd bring him here after school, small hands, curious eyes, always full of questions. Now I sat in that same place, older, stiffer, trying to piece my life back together in the quiet. When dawn came, I got up and walked toward the nearby bus stop. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay still. By mid-morning, I found myself wandering past a row of new townhouses not far from the park. One looked strangely familiar. Brendan and Kayla had once mentioned wanting to move there someday. It was a sleek development, wide windows, modern railings, fresh paint. And then I saw them. Through the sheer curtains of the corner unit, Brendan stood near the dining table. Kayla sat across from him, flipping through a folder. Their heads were close, their voices low, expressions intent. She laughed light and sharp. Brendan managed a tight smile. She held up a glossy brochure, a photo of a bright white kitchen shining under perfect lighting. She pointed at it with eager excitement. Brendan didn't laugh. He picked up a mug, lifted it to his lips but didn't drink. His gaze drifted toward the window. For a heartbeat, I thought he'd seen me standing there, but he didn't react. Maybe he wasn't looking at anything at all. Kayla said something else, her tone animated. Brendan nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping, that same defeated posture he used to have when he was a teenager and didn't want to argue. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. All the tiny moments from the past months snapped into focus like puzzle pieces falling perfectly into place. Kayla insisting on handling the utility bills, Brendan's avoidance whenever I brought up the house, the odd envelopes with his name but my address, the hesitation in his voice when I asked simple questions. I had missed the signs, or maybe I had chosen not to see them. I stood there until the curtain fluttered slightly, maybe from the breeze, maybe from someone moving inside. My legs felt heavy as I turned away, not from fatigue, but from the growing weight of realization. There was no confrontation that day. No shouting through the door, no scene. Only the sharp, hollow understanding that what had happened wasn't sudden, it was planned, deliberate, and I had been the very last to know. I kept walking until I reached the lake near the library. The water's surface was perfectly still. I sat on the low stone wall and let that stillness seep into me. I didn't cry, but for the first time since I'd read that 6-word note, I began to wonder just how deep the damage went, and how long it had been quietly growing beneath the surface. The next morning, I wandered toward the public library, not searching for books, but for power outlets and quiet corners. My phone had died sometime during the night, and since I hadn't brought a charger, assuming I'd be home by now, I needed somewhere to reconnect. I found a spot near the wide window, plugged in my phone, and waited as it buzzed slowly back to life. Only one notification blinked on the screen, a missed call from Brendan. No voicemail, no text, just a timestamp, 11:42 p.m. the night before. I stared at it, unmoving. He hadn't tried again. There was no follow-up. I locked the screen and slipped the phone into my pocket. Then I heard my name. At first it was soft, uncertain, almost like a memory. Then clearer. Marjorie? I turned and there she was, Martina Wilkes. I hadn't seen her in nearly 6 years. We used to work together in legal insurance review. Sharp, quick-witted Martina, the kind of woman who read contracts with a magnifying glass and called out every missed comma. She'd always worn confidence like armor. We hugged briefly, the kind of hug that says I remember you but doesn't demand stories. She asked what brought me in. I gave her a vague answer, just passing time, catching up on reading. She didn't push. She never did. Instead, she offered coffee from the vending machine down the hall. We sat near the side window, the morning light painting long rectangles across the carpet. After some small talk, about aging knees, bad coffee and the latest headlines, she leaned forward, lowering her voice. She told me she'd run into Kayla at a local property mixer a week ago. Her tone was casual at first, but her eyes stayed sharp. Kayla, she said, had been all smiles, chatting about future plans for the house, possibly listing it soon. There was a new development nearby, and she and Brendan were considering options. Martina assumed, of course, that I had already moved out, downsized, maybe to a smaller place. I didn't respond right away. I didn't have to. My face must have said everything. Martina's brows drew together, the way they did when she spotted a missing clause in a policy. Something's off, she said simply. I nodded, slow and heavy, letting silence confirm what neither of us wanted to articulate. Then she asked, carefully, do you still have access to the title documents? I used to, I said, her lips pressed together. She told me about a case she'd handled once, a daughter-in-law who quietly switched the power of attorney, moved her mother-in-law into assisted living, and sold the house within 6 weeks. All done with polite smiles and forged signatures, the colour must have drained from my face. Not out of fear, but recognition. I began recalling the subtle signs I had ignored, Kayla offering to handle the water bill, Brendan forgetting to give me the insurance renewal, the missing checkbook last spring. They hadn't been accidents. Martina reached into her bag and pulled out a card. "If you want, I can help you look into this," she said gently. She still did part-time consulting for women in tricky family transitions, cases where affection and paperwork collided. She'd seen too many mothers slowly written out of their own lives by bureaucracy and betrayal disguised as good intentions. I took the card, even though I still had her number written in an old notebook, buried somewhere in my house, or what used to be my house. We sat in silence after that. The kind of silence that isn't awkward, the kind shared between women who understand grief without words. Later that afternoon, I walked to the post office and rented a small P.O. box. It wasn't much, just a metal drawer in a government building, but it was mine. A place for my name, my mail, my proof of existence. A place no one could intercept. That evening, I checked into a small women's shelter nearby. As I sat by the window watching the orange light stretch across the sidewalk, I felt something new. Not sadness, not shock, but clarity. The storm wasn't over. But I was done standing in the rain. The old studio, the key still worked. It had been more than 5 years since I last stepped inside my old studio, a second-floor space above the dusty bookstore downtown. My hand remembered the turn of the lock, the slight resistance before the door gave way with its familiar creak. This used to be where I met clients back when I worked part-time as an insurance claims consultant after Richard passed away. The house back then had felt too full of echoes and unfinished conversations. I'd kept this place as a retreat, my quiet refuge. Only Martina ever knew about it. The air smelled like time itself, a mix of dust, lemon oil and faint lavender from a sachet I'd left in the drawer years ago. I ran my fingers across the wooden shelves, the edge of the desk where I once sorted pension forms for widows who had no one left to guide them. In the back cabinet, under a pile of old manila folders and a chipped holiday mug, I found what I was looking for, the original deed and a notarized copy of the title, all still bearing my name. Brendan's wasn't anywhere on it, not even as a beneficiary. I sat at the desk, spread the papers out before me and kept digging. There was more. The co-ownership agreement Richard and I had drafted decades ago when we bought the house. It clearly stated that if one of us passed, the other retained full rights. Brendan had never been added, not once discussed. We had wanted him to build his own life, not inherit ours. Then came a stack of recent bills, water, power, trash, the ones I'd habitually kept in my bag. All of them were now addressed to Kayla. My name had been scrubbed away, replaced cleanly and quietly. It hadn't been gradual. It had been surgical. At the top of one envelope was a utility request form, my signature forged in clumsy imitation. The handwriting wasn't mine. They'd already started the process of removing me, not just from the house, but from existence, one form at a time. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened the small fireproof safe beneath my desk and placed the deed, the co-ownership agreement, a copy of my ID, and my latest tax return inside. I locked it tight. Then I stood in the centre of that small studio and looked around. No photos of Brendan here, only one of Richard and me at a fundraiser. Mid-laughter, mid-life. I closed the door softly behind me, not out of fear of making noise, but because something sacred had shifted. They thought I was gone. But they had no idea what I still held, not just on paper, but in resolve. The next morning, I found myself standing at a crosswalk outside Martina's office, an envelope clutched tight under my coat. Around me, the city pulsed with motion, people rushing past with coffee cups, earbuds, briefcases, and that same blind energy of weekday mornings. None of them could have guessed what I carried in my hands, proof that I had been slowly erased, deliberately and quietly. Inside, Martina's office smelled just as it had years ago, a mix of lavender oil and printer toner. She greeted me with that familiar, no-nonsense expression, the kind that always seemed to say, "Let's skip the small talk," without a word. I spread the documents across her desk, the house deed, the joint ownership agreement, the forged utility forms, the tax statements, all of it. Every paper that showed the pieces of me someone had tried to cut out. Martina didn't react dramatically. She didn't gasp or ask questions. She simply examined each page, flipping back twice, her eyes narrowing slightly as she pieced together the truth. When she finally looked up, her voice was steady. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Marjorie. They're laying groundwork, trying to remove you quietly, and they're counting on the fact that you won't fight back." Her words didn't sting. They just landed, like something I had already known but hadn't allowed myself to name. For a long moment, we both sat in silence, two women who had seen too much of how easily the system bends for those who know how to use it. Then Martina picked up her phone. She dialed someone immediately, her tone clipped and professional. Within minutes, she had a name, Ashby Sterling, a retired estate attorney who, as Martina put it, didn't just read contracts, she read people. Ashby had spent decades specialising in asset protection for older women who had been pressured, manipulated, or tricked out of their own property. 2 days later, I stood on the porch of Ashby's home office, a small, immaculate house with white trim and a front swing that moved lazily in the breeze. The curtains fluttered in the window as though someone had just walked past. When she opened the door, Ashby greeted me with a calm nod. Silver hair cropped short, sharp eyes that seemed to see more than you said. She led me inside without unnecessary chatter. The interior matched her demeanour, quiet but deliberate. Every book, every pen, every paper perfectly arranged. I handed her the folder. She read through everything, page by page, her eyes moving like a surgeon's hands, slow, precise, and methodical. When she was done, she folded her fingers together and said in an even tone, "Nothing here changes the fact that you are still the sole legal owner. The utilities, the mail redirection, the digital change of address, all of it is circumstantial. None of it represents a lawful transfer, but if they try to leverage this to refinance or sell, that crosses into fraud." I felt the heat rush back into my cheeks. I hadn't realised how cold I'd been until that moment. Ashby laid out the plan with military precision, a cease and desist letter, formally drafted and delivered, a notification to the county clerk to flag any attempted title, transactions, and a soft legal restriction that would delay any unauthorised movement of ownership. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective, a quiet wall of legality that couldn't be ignored. That afternoon we printed everything. I signed the documents with a pen that didn't tremble. Martina arranged a courier to deliver sealed envelopes, one to Brendan's law office downtown, another to Kayla's workplace at the wellness clinic. Ashby also suggested an additional safeguard, a protective memorandum filed with the local property registry and neighbourhood council. It would alert realtors and financial institutions that any transaction concerning my property must be verified directly by me. It wouldn't stop them outright, but it would slow them down enough to make them hesitate. When everything was in motion, I stood in Ashby's hallway waiting for my ride home. There was a mirror beside the coat rack. I caught my reflection. Tired eyes, yes, but behind them something had changed. A steadiness. A boundary drawn in quiet ink. They hadn't taken everything. They had just mistaken my silence for surrender, and that I knew would be their greatest mistake. The first calls by the end of that week, every letter had been delivered, couriered, stamped, and filed. One to Brendan's office, one to Kayla's, a third to the county records department. I hadn't spoken a single word to either of them since the day I found my belongings on the porch. Then, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang. Brendan's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then again, no voicemail, no text. Just repeated calls, spaced far enough apart that I knew he was waiting for me to slip, to pick up out of habit. By the 6th attempt, A message came in. Not from him, but from Kayla. You didn't have to go this far. That was all it said. I stared at it for a long while, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then slowly I typed back one line. Everything has a reason. So does this. I knew silence would speak louder than anything else. A return to the neighbourhood the next morning, I walked through my old neighbourhood just after sunrise. I didn't go to the house. I simply wandered along the sidewalk near the park, past the community garden where I used to take Brendan when he was small. The air smelled faintly of dew and memory. From a distance, I could see the backyard. The blinds were drawn, the house still. By noon, my phone buzzed. Martina. She told me Brendan had sent an email to her firm's general inbox, asking if the cease and desist was legitimate. Ashby responded personally, polite, professional and unyielding. She confirmed that the order was active, listed her license number, and offered him directions to the county records office if he needed independent confirmation. No emotion. No accusation. Just fact and cold, clean and final. That evening Brendan showed up at my studio. He knocked softly, then waited. When I opened the door, he looked smaller somehow, not by stature but by spirit. His eyes were tired, not angry, more confused than anything else. He asked if we could talk. I stepped aside, not to invite him in, but to show I wasn't afraid. He glanced around the room, taking in the scattered papers and the quiet stillness of the space. His gaze lingered on the stack of legal documents, spread across my table. He began to speak haltingly. He said he hadn't known the full extent of what Kayla had done, that she had taken charge because she thought I needed rest, that it had all gone too far. I didn't interrupt. When he finally trailed off, I asked one question, not as a mother to her son, but as a woman speaking to a man who should have known better. Why didn't you stop her? He stared at the floor. His voice was small when it came. Because I didn't want the conflict. Because it felt easier to stay quiet. Because I didn't think you'd fight back. It wasn't cruelty. It was cowardice. He hadn't chosen her over me. He had chosen comfort over courage. And that, I realised, was its own kind of betrayal. He asked if there was anything he could do to fix it. I told him the truth, that the letters had been sent, the alerts filed, the title secured. The house was no longer at risk. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't need to. When he left, I closed the door gently behind him, not in anger, not in grief, but with quiet certainty. The kind that comes when you've already lost the illusion of family and found something far steadier in its place. Yourself. The following days passed without another word from Brendan or Kayla. I didn't expect apologies. Not anymore. And I certainly didn't expect remorse, but I did expect movement, reaction. And when it came, it was as deliberate as everything else they had done. That Saturday morning, a courier arrived at my studio. He handed me a crisp white envelope, my name typed neatly across the front, no return address. Inside was a letter from a real estate firm addressed not to me, but to Brendan and Kayla. It included a carbon copy of an internal request, a pre-sale property evaluation form. My house. For a long moment I just stared at it. No panic. No tears. Just a calm, cold understanding. They were testing the waters, pushing against the legal walls Ashby had built. Hoping, maybe, that someone in the system would overlook the restrictions and let them slip through unnoticed. A quiet attempt. A shadow move. I called Martina. She arrived an hour later, her hair slightly windblown, her expression already taut. She scanned the letter once, muttered something under her breath, then pulled out her phone. Within minutes she had Ashby on the line. They moved quickly, like soldiers who'd been here before. Ashby requested scanned copies of every page and immediately filed a second-level restriction with the property registrar. She flagged the realtor directly, issuing a formal legal notification. From that moment forward, any attempt to inquire about or access information related to my house would require my notarized authorization, in person, verified and sealed, the wall around my name. My home was now made of iron. Still, the audacity stunned me. Not the forgery itself, that was expected by now, but the ease. The confidence. As if years of love, of family dinners and bedtime stories, could be wiped away with a single digital form, as if the history inside those walls meant nothing more than a transaction waiting to be signed. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were filled with paper, contracts, signatures, envelopes, each one carrying a version of my name that wasn't quite mine. By Sunday afternoon, Brendan came again. He didn't knock this time, just stood outside the studio door until I opened it. His face was different. Not desperate, not pleading, calculated, controlled. He asked if we could talk. I nodded, but didn't invite him in. He stayed on the porch, his posture defensive but tired. He said Kayla had made a mistake, that things had moved too quickly, that she was afraid I might retaliate, or make everything public. He used words like misunderstanding, oversight, communication gap, phrases that mean nothing and everything all at once. I didn't respond. I let the silence stretch. Finally, I met his eyes and said what I had been holding back since the night my belongings sat waiting on the porch. You knew. You always knew. And you let it happen, because it was easier for you. He didn't deny it. He just sighed, shoulders sagging, and said quietly, I never wanted it to come to this. I'm tired, Mom. Standing between you and Kayla. It's impossible. That was the moment something inside me broke. Not from pain, but from revelation. He hadn't been trapped. He hadn't been manipulated. He had made a choice. Not out of hatred, but out of cowardice. Standing with me would have required courage. And comfort, it seemed, had always been easier than courage. I thanked him for coming. Then I closed the door. Not with anger. Not with bitterness, just with finality. The kind that seals a chapter. The fraud. The next morning, the city was wrapped in fog, soft and grey. I walked across the street to Martina's office with a paper bag of scones and a quiet sense of resolve. Something told me things weren't over. When I stepped inside, Martina was standing by the window, arms folded, a stack of papers on her desk. She didn't greet me. She just said, in a voice that was calm but heavy, We've got a problem. She spread the pages in front of me. At the top was a loan pre-approval form from a regional bank. It listed two names, Brendan Lindell and Marjorie Lindell. My name. Next to it, a digital signature that looked almost perfect. Almost. The loops were wrong. The slant was off. But to someone rushing through a pile of paperwork, it would have passed. Martina had pulled the records from a private financial monitoring service she sometimes used for her clients. Something about Brendan's activity had triggered a soft alert, an account created under a joint ownership profile. Complete with fabricated authorization documents, he had used a scanned copy of my old driver's license and a utility bill with my name still faintly visible. Evidence just convincing enough to slip through casual review. Felt my stomach twist, not in shock, but in a quiet kind of exhaustion. This wasn't carelessness. It was intent. They weren't just trying to remove me from their lives anymore. They were trying to erase my existence on paper. Martina called Ashby immediately. Within an hour. She was in the office, her leather case under one arm, glasses glinting in the window light. She took one look at the documents and said flatly, He's built a false authorization trail. That's forgery. And if he submitted anything online, that's wire fraud. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Ashby moved like a storm in still air. She drafted a formal complaint to the bank's fraud department and filed a quiet notice with the district attorney's office under a discretionary flag protocol, the kind used to handle sensitive family financial crimes. Then she produced a second document, one that would effectively, freeze any property transactions or claims connected to my name or address. No one could move so much as a piece of paper without in-person verification from me. A silent lockdown. Brendan wouldn't know about it until he tried again. But when he did, he'd hit a wall made of paper, proof, and precision. Martina sat beside me while Ashby worked, the sound of the keyboard filling the room. After a while, Martina spoke softly. Some sons take after their mothers. Others learn from different examples. I didn't answer. I just stared out the window. 2 sparrows were fighting over crumbs on the sidewalk, their wings flashing in the pale light. I thought of Brendan, the little boy who once scraped his knees running through that same street, grass-stained jeans and laughter echoing in the air. And then I thought of the man who had tried to write my name into something he hadn't earned. By the end of the day, everything was filed, sealed, and backed up in multiple systems. Ashby notarized every affidavit, double-checked every form. I left the office with a folder tucked under my arm and something new in my chest. Not anger, not grief, but clarity. They had erased me on paper, but I had written myself back in. The invitation came quietly, a text from Brendan. Short, polite, too carefully worded to be casual. We're having a family discussion Saturday. Hope you can come. It's time to clear the air. The phrase family discussion sat on the screen like it still meant something, like there was still a family left to return to. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I forwarded the message to Ashby, who replied within minutes, I'll come with you. Just in case. The meeting Saturday afternoon arrived grey and wind-heavy, the kind of weather that makes you instinctively wrap your coat tighter. Ashby pulled up in her navy sedan, composed as always, briefcase in hand, calm in her posture. Inside that briefcase was a single bound document, the notarized cease and desist letter. Formal and final, as we drove neither of us spoke much. The city rolled by in shades of muted silver, and I found myself tracing the window's condensation with my finger, thinking of how strange it was to be heading toward a place that used to be my home, yet now felt foreign. When we turned the corner and I saw the house, my breath caught. It looked exactly as I remembered. The white shutters, the red door, the planter box still clinging to life with a few stubborn petunias. But everything about it felt wrong, like I was staring at a replica of a memory. The details were familiar, but the warmth was gone. Inside, the house had been staged, literally, cushions perfectly arranged, candles burning on the coffee table, a carefully curated cheese board untouched beside 2 glasses of wine. Kayla stood near the fireplace, her sweater pressed and perfect, her smile stretched just a little too wide. Brendan hovered nearby, eyes darting between me and Ashby, his nervousness spilling into every gesture. We sat down, but no one touched the food. Kayla began speaking first, her tone rehearsed, smooth, careful, like someone pitching a business proposal. We just wanted to talk, to have an open and respectful dialogue, she said, her hands folded neatly. This is still your home too, Marjorie. We all just need to find a way forward. Her voice dripped with performance, not sincerity, but presentation. Ashby didn't flinch. She calmly reached into her briefcase, removed the sealed document, and placed it on the table. When she spoke, her tone was even but unyielding. Actually, this home belongs solely to my client, Marjorie Lindell. She remains the legal owner on all official records. Any representations to the contrary have been formally challenged and recorded. This isn't a discussion, as it's a confirmation. Silence, Brendan paled. Kayla blinked twice, the way people do when their carefully planned story collapses mid-sentence. Ashby continued, her words cutting clean and sharp. We are also aware of forged documents submitted to multiple institutions. Those filings have been reported and flagged. Further legal action is pending. For now, my client reserves every right to pursue prosecution. Kayla's composure cracked. Her voice lowered, tighter now. This isn't how we wanted things to go. I looked at her then. Really looked. For the first time, I saw the fracture beneath her control, the realization that whatever game she'd been playing had just turned against her. Brendan opened his mouth as if to speak, but stopped. His eyes stayed on the document, hands clenched so tightly his knuckles blanched. I rose from my seat. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. My voice was steady when I said, "You tried to write me out of my own life. You thought I wouldn't notice." Then I turned and walked toward the door. Ashby followed, pausing only once to deliver the final blow. Calm. "Clear, absolute. If you attempt to interfere again, legal proceedings will begin immediately." We stepped outside into the wind. It was colder than before, but it felt clean, like something stagnant had finally been blown away. The drive back was silent, but it wasn't the same silence I'd carried before. This one felt purposeful, like the pause before rebuilding. They had wanted to bury me in paperwork, but I had unearthed myself. The final goodbye, the next morning, I packed a small overnight bag and returned to the house one last time. I still had the keys, and though I was the rightful owner, I knew ownership and belonging weren't the same thing anymore. When I stepped inside, the air felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Kayla was in the kitchen, washing dishes with unnecessary force. Brendan sat at the dining table, hands clasped in front of him like a child awaiting reprimand. They didn't speak. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the silence define the space between us. Then I said it, the words that had been waiting at the edge of my tongue for weeks. "I'm selling the house." Kayla froze, mid-motion. Brendan looked up, lips parting but no words forming. I continued, not out of revenge, not to punish either of you, but because it's mine, and I no longer wish to share my name with walls that have forgotten me. I placed a folder on the table. Inside was the signed listing agreement, prepared quietly by Ashby. Brendan's voice broke the silence. "But where will you go? Where will you live?" I looked at him, not cruelly, not with anger, but with a calm that had taken root deep inside me. "That's not your concern anymore." He blinked, his gaze dropping to the floor. Kayla didn't meet my eyes. I saw the faint tremble in her shoulders, but I felt no urge to comfort her. Comfort was a currency I no longer had to give. As I turned to leave, I paused. There was one final thing to say, the truth they both deserved to hear. "The sale proceeds won't be going into your pockets." Kayla stiffened. Brendan inhaled sharply. "I've transferred every dollar into a new foundation, a fund for women over 60 who've been manipulated, discarded, or silenced by their own families. It will help them find legal support, secure housing, and reclaim dignity." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. "Martina will serve as executive director. Ashby will oversee compliance. This house once built a family, but families fall apart when love becomes conditional. So I'm letting it go. No threats, no anger, just truth. You made space by pushing me out. Now I'll make space for someone else who needs it." I didn't wait for a reply. I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me. Not out of sorrow, but reverence. For what was, and what could now begin. The morning sun had climbed higher, scattering frost across the sidewalk like scattered glass. My breath fogged in the air, but I felt warm, warmer than I had in years. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened the email draft waiting in my inbox, the press release Ashby had written for the foundation. I hit send or take quiet launch, a simple paragraph buried in a local newsletter. Nothing flashy, just a seed planted, because I knew someone, somewhere would read it. And maybe, for a moment, they'd sit with the weight of what they'd thrown away. The apartment was small, but filled with light. Morning sunlight poured through the east-facing window, spilling across the wooden floor like gold. It wasn't grand, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. My bedroom was simple. A modest reading chair by the window, a single framed photograph, just me standing at the edge of the ocean years ago. A small lavender plant sat on the sill, its scent faint but calming. I named it Mercy. There was no television. I didn't need one. In the evenings I turned on the radio, jazz, local weather and soft voices that drifted through the static. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt intentional. Every morning I brewed tea, laced up my walking shoes and stepped outside. Behind the building, a narrow trail wound through low pine trees. The air smelled of earth and beginnings. Each day I walked the same path, steady, familiar. Sometimes a woman jogged past me with her golden retriever. We never spoke, but after a few weeks she started smiling first. That was enough. On weekends Martina would visit. She always brought pastries from the cafe near her office, buttery, still warm, and updates about the foundation. Donations were small at first, but steady. People were beginning to notice. She read me a letter one afternoon from a woman in Utah who'd seen the foundation mentioned in a church newsletter. The letter was handwritten in careful script. It said, "Thank you for existing." I read it twice. We both sat quietly after that. Some gratitude doesn't need conversation. It just fills the room and settles somewhere in your chest. After the sale, the old house had officially sold. The paperwork finalised cleanly. Kayla and Brendan had already moved out before the transfer, per the terms Ashby filed. There were no calls, no messages, no attempts at reconciliation, and for the first time that silence didn't ache. It didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like space. In the evenings I began writing. Nothing formal, just thoughts, memories, quiet fragments stitched into a soft brown notebook. Some pages were about my childhood, others about the garden, and many about silence, how it can wound or heal depending on who holds it. One afternoon, a call came from a women's organisation in the city. Someone had passed my name along. They were hosting a seminar on elder autonomy and wanted a speaker, someone who had lived the reality behind the statistics. I said yes without hesitation. That night, I stood by my window, looking out over the parking lot below. Street lamps painted long shadows across the pavement. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I just felt present. There was peace in that. I turned off the lamp, slid into bed and let the quiet wrap around me, not to shut the world out, but to finally hear myself breathe. The photograph weeks later, while rearranging the small cabinet beneath my desk, I found it again, the old photo from Brendan's college graduation. Everyone was there. Brendan, Kayla, my sister-in-law, even a few distant relatives. I remembered the day clearly, the heat, the laughter, the way Brendan had wrapped his arm around my shoulders for the picture. But as I looked closer, I noticed something I hadn't before, or maybe something I had refused to see. The edge of the photograph had been trimmed. My face had carefully, cleanly, had been cut out, not torn, not crumpled, removed, precisely, surgically. I stared at it for a long time. Not out of shock, not even sadness, and just understanding. I didn't cry. I didn't throw it away. Instead, I slipped the photo into a small cloth pouch and tucked it into a wooden box at the back of my closet. Inside that box were pieces of another life, a ribbon from Brendan's 5th grade spelling bee, a set of old keys, a birthday card signed in crayon by his child. It said only, "Happy birthday, no mention of Grandma." Just a drawing of a red balloon. I closed the box gently, not with grief, but with stillness. The Bloom people often think healing is loud, that it comes like thunder all at once, tearing the sky open. But sometimes it moves like breath. Quiet. Barely there. You don't notice it until you realise you're standing taller. Breathing easier. I never erased Brendan or Kayla from my story. I simply stopped centering them in it. There's a kind of strength in letting go, not for revenge, not for pride, but for clarity, for peace. That spring, I planted new lavender on the windowsill. It bloomed unevenly, one stem crooked toward the sun, the other still reaching. But it grew, and that was enough. I didn't look back, not even once. If this story found a quiet place inside you, I want to thank you for listening. So many women spend years living inside silence before they finally choose themselves. Have you ever felt erased, not in words, but in presence? If so, I invite you to share or simply to reflect, because your story, like mine, carries weight, and sometimes in telling it or hearing it, we begin to bloom again, quietly, steadily, in our own light.